The night was colder than usual, a bitter wind sweeping across the barren plains, rattling dry branches and stirring the dust into small whirlwinds beneath a lone cottonwood tree. Near a slow-moving creek, a small burlap sack lay motionless on the frozen ground inside. A newborn baby girl struggled to draw breath, her tiny chest rising and falling in weak, desperate attempts. Her cries were muffled by the coarse fabric, yet they were filled with the rawest form of pleading, a fragile sound that seemed almost too small to matter in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Hours earlier, the baby had been carried to this place by unknown hands. Her parents, if they could be called that, had made a cold, cruel decision. Life in this harsh land was too much, they said, too dangerous, too uncertain, so they had left her to die. Tied in a sack, abandoned beside the creek where the water ran shallow but icy, the moon hung high in the sky, casting a ghostly silver light on the scene. Her tiny fists pounded the cloth, her breath visible in the frosty air, yet no one came. Back the infant's first moments of awareness were filled with confusion and fear. The cold bit into her skin, and the mud beneath her made her shiver violently. Her eyes, barely open, reflected the dim moonlight. Filled with a strange intelligence for someone so small, she recognized only two things: the immediate discomfort of the cold and the desperate need for warmth. Food and protection. Time seemed endless. The wind moaned through the trees, rattling the branches like a chorus of mournful spirits. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries echoing across the plains. The baby's cries grew weaker, punctuated by brief, helpless whimpers. Her tiny lips formed a sound that would reach across the wilderness and into the hearts of anyone who heard it. Mama ... The word was instinctual, a plea for care and protection, a fragile hope cast into the night in that moment. The universe seemed indifferent. The creek trickled quietly beside her, reflecting the cold light of the stars. The prairie stretched endlessly, unyielding and vast, threatening to swallow the smallest forms of life without mercy. Yet, even as her body grew cold and fatigue weighed on her tiny limbs, a spark of life persisted. She kicked, twisted, and pushed against the fabric, each movement an act of survival. The baby's voice, small yet piercing, carried farther than anyone could have imagined. Somewhere along the distant ridges, the faint echo of her cries cut through the morning mist, unnoticed at first, but destined to reach the one person who could answer it as dawn approached. The sky shifted from the inky black of night to muted hues of gray and pale gold. The first rays of sunlight touched the creek, casting glittering reflections on the water and the frost-covered ground. The baby, though exhausted, continued to make tiny sounds, her desperate "Mama, Mama," trembling through the air. She did not know that this sound would soon bring salvation. Hours passed like eternity. She was small,
fragile, and alone, yet alive. The wilderness,
harsh and indifferent, had tested her will and her strength. But in those first moments of dawn, her voice became a beacon. It was not just a cry for her mother, it was a call for life, a plea that would reach the heart of a man who would soon transform her fate. Unseen by the baby, the distant sound of hooves began to disturb the quiet plains. A figure rode slowly, unaware that fate was about to intervene. The moment that would define the baby's life and the life of the lonely cowboy who would save her was already unfolding on the horizon. Her first cry, small yet desperate, had set everything into motion. The prairie in the early morning held a quiet that was both beautiful and unnerving. Mist clung to the low hills, and the frost on the tall grasses sparkled faintly in the first rays of sunlight. Jacob Kane, a lone cowboy hardened by years of solitude on the frontier, rode slowly along the creek that cut through the valley. His horse, Dusty, snorted at the chill in the air, stamping its hooves and tossing its head. Jacob's eyes, sharp and accustomed to scanning for danger, swept across the landscape. He was used to this land, its beauty, its peril, and its ruthless indifference. Then, faintly, He heard it, a sound so small it could almost have been mistaken for the wind. A soft, desperate cry. He paused mid-step. Ears straining, the sound came again. Mama. Mama! His heart skipped. Only a child could make such a sound, so weak yet filled with urgent need. Without hesitation, Jacob guided Dusty toward the noise, kicking the horse into a gentle trot as he drew closer. He spotted a small burlap sack lying, partially hidden in the frost-covered grass near the creek. A chill ran down his spine. Dismounting quickly, he approached cautiously, scanning the area for anyone or anything that might pose a threat. The prairie was empty. Save for the distant cries of crows and the whisper of wind through the trees, Jacob's hand hovered near his revolver. But he felt no fear, only concern. He knelt beside the sack and carefully untied the rough ropes binding it inside. He found her, a newborn girl, barely clinging to life, shivering violently in the cold dawn. Her wide eyes stared up at him, bright yet filled with confusion, and her tiny lips trembled as she whispered again, "Mama." Jacob's chest tightened. He had known hardship, had faced storms, bandits, and starvation, but nothing had prepared him for the raw vulnerability of this small life. He gently lifted the baby into his coat, wrapping her against his chest, feeling the fragile warmth of her tiny body against him. The girl's whimpers were weak, but the moment she felt Jacob's heartbeat beneath her, they slowed slightly. The baby's presence awakened something in Jacob he hadn't felt in years, a fierce protective instinct, raw and immediate. He glanced down at her pale face, noticing the faint smudges of dirt and dried blood, and felt a deep anger at whoever had abandoned her. Yet he pushed that anger aside. It wasn't his place to dwell on cruelty. His job was clear. Keep her alive. He mounted Dusty again, moving carefully along the narrow creek trail. The baby, sensing warmth and safety, relaxed slightly, nestling against his chest. Jacob's mind raced. He had a cabin nearby, stocked with basic provisions, and he knew it would be enough to sustain her for now. He would need to feed her, warm her, and care for her every need. But more than that, he would need to protect her from the dangers that lurked in this wilderness: cold nights, wild animals, and the ruthless indifference of the frontier itself. As they rode, Jacob kept glancing down at her tiny face, and she looked back at him with eyes full of trust despite her fear. He realized then that this child had chosen him in a way. Her cries had carried across the open prairie directly to him. Fate had placed her in his path, and he would not fail. The time the cabin appeared through the morning mist, the baby had quieted. Lulled by the steady rhythm of Dusty's trot and the warmth of Jacob's coat, he dismounted and carried her inside. Gently laying her in a makeshift cradle, lighting a fire, he began preparing warm water and feeding her what little he could manage, murmuring soothing words he hadn't spoken to another living soul in years in that quiet cabin. With smoke curling from the chimney and the first sun rays spilling through the windows, Jacob realized his life had changed. A child left to die had found him, and in saving her, he was about to discover a purpose that would reshape his lonely existence forever. The baby had survived the wilderness by sheer chance, but now, in Jacob Kane's arms, she had found her first true protector. Jacob Kane's cabin had never been so alive. What had once been a quiet, lonely place now echoed with the tiny noises of a life that depended entirely on him. The baby, whom he had begun calling simply Little One, had survived the cold and the creek. But she was far from safe. She was fragile, her body small and delicate, her cries piercing yet weak. Jacob spent the first hours after bringing her inside tending to her as carefully as if she were made of glass. He wrapped her in layers of blankets, cradled her against his chest, and rocked her while whispering promises he wasn't sure he fully understood himself. The baby's survival depended on warmth, nourishment, and vigilance. Jacob boiled water and mixed it with milk powder salvaged from his stores, testing the temperature with the inside of his wrist before offering it to her. She drank hesitantly at first, Then greedily, as if instinctively understanding that this man was her lifeline, each swallow was a victory. A small triumph over the neglect and cruelty she had already endured. In her brief life, Jacob realized that the wilderness outside was as dangerous as the humans, who had abandoned her cold nights, could kill as easily as wolves or bandits. He built a fire, ensuring it never went out, and placed the baby close enough to feel the heat, but far enough to avoid the flames. Every snap of wood in the fire and every creak of the cabin floor was a potential threat in his mind. Yet he remained calm, steady, and deliberate. Everything the baby needed him to be days turned into weeks. Jacob established a routine: feeding, cleaning, rocking the baby, and keeping watch over the surrounding prairie. He talked to her as he worked, describing the cabin, the land, and the sky beyond, as if he could teach her the world even before she could understand it. Slowly, he began to notice small signs of life beyond mere survival: tiny fingers grasping at his coat, attempts to make sounds beyond crying, even the faintest smile curling at the corners of her mouth when she recognized him. Jacob also grappled with fear and uncertainty. The child's parents were nowhere in sight, and the thought of authorities taking her away, or worse, more neglectful hands claiming her, haunted him. He debated how long he could keep her safe, wondering if he was capable of raising someone entirely dependent on him. He had lived a life of solitude, hardened by loss and the relentless frontier, yet every small milestone she reached, a full feeding, a giggle, her first attempts at lifting her head, broke through that armor, revealing a tenderness he had long thought lost through it all. The baby's voice began to change. The weak mama she had whispered in the wilderness became stronger, more insistent. It echoed through the cabin as if she were calling not just for a mother, but for someone who would protect her, nurture her, and love her unconditionally. Jacob, though not her mother, felt the pull of that plea deep in his chest. He realized that this child had brought him a new responsibility and a purpose. He had not anticipated a life to protect, guide, and cherish outside. The prairie remained harsh and unforgiving, but the cabin had become a sanctuary. Jacob built additional layers of protection, barricading windows against wind, stacking firewood for long nights, and creating a safe space where she could rest. In those small, meticulous acts of care, the bond between man and child deepened. By the end of the month, little one was thriving. Her cheeks were rounder, her cries stronger and more expressive, and her eyes brightened with curiosity. Jacob watched her closely, feeling a pride and tenderness he had never experienced. She had survived the cruelty of abandonment, and now, nurtured by his steady hands, she was beginning to flourish in those quiet moments by the fire. As he hummed low tunes and watched her drift into sleep, Jacob understood that their lives were now intertwined. The wilderness had tested her survival, but within the cabin, nurtured by him, she was discovering life, and he, in turn, was rediscovering what it meant to care, to hope, and to love again. The tiny life in his arms had changed everything after the long, relentless winter storm had passed. The prairie slowly began to awaken. The snow melted into silver streams that glistened under the morning sun, and the frost on the cabin's roof disappeared in soft plumes of vapor. For Jacob Kane and the baby he had rescued, the aftermath of the storm was not only a relief, it was a turning point. Survival was no longer simply about enduring the elements. It had become about life blossoming against the odds inside the small cabin. The atmosphere was different. The air was warmer, lighter, and filled with the sounds of life rather than struggle. The baby, now growing stronger with each passing day, had begun to express herself beyond mere cries. Her coos and giggles filled the room, a stark contrast to the desperate mama she had whispered when Jacob first found her. Jacob watched her closely, noting the spark of curiosity in her eyes and the way she reached for his hands as he moved about the cabin. Each gesture, each attempt to interact with him, was a sign that she was thriving, not just surviving. Jacob began to teach her small routines, simple patterns that would form the foundation of her life. He showed her the fire, how to hold herself safely nearby, and how to recognize the sounds of the prairie from the safety of the cabin. The baby's fascination with everything around her, from the flickering flames to the glint of morning dew on the window, was infectious. It reminded Jacob of the small wonders he himself had long ignored in his solitary life. Through her eyes, even the rugged, unforgiving land seemed filled with possibility. The bond between them grew deeper with every shared moment. The baby's eyes followed him wherever he went, her tiny fingers occasionally curling around his coat or hand. Jacob began speaking to her more often, narrating his actions, telling her the names of objects, and even recounting stories from his own past. Though he spoke softly, unsure of whether she could understand, it didn't matter. The cadence of his voice, the warmth in his tone, and the consistency of his care became a source of security for her. Jacob also noticed a subtle transformation in himself. He had lived years in solitude, hardened by loss and the harshness of the frontier, but watching the baby grow, respond, and trust him rekindled something he had long thought lost. Hope. Each new milestone, the first time she sat upright, the tentative reaching for a rattle, the delighted squeal when he lifted her into the air, was a reminder that life could flourish even in the harshest conditions. He realized that hope was not just an abstract feeling but a tangible force, growing as surely as the child in his care. There were moments when Jacob paused to reflect on the fragile nature of their situation. The wilderness was still unpredictable, and the dangers of isolation persisted, but those fears were tempered by the joy of seeing the baby's resilience. He began to envision a future, not just of survival but of family, of a life that could include love, laughter, and belonging. The tiny home that had been a refuge now felt like the beginning of something more profound, a place where trust and care could flourish alongside the child. Even the baby seemed to sense the change in the air. Her cries became less frequent, replaced by sounds of curiosity and play. She reached out for Jacob's face, giggled when he made silly noises, and rested peacefully against him without fear. Each small interaction was a confirmation. She was safe. She was thriving, and she had the potential to grow into a life filled with warmth and possibility. Spring had returned to the prairie, melting the remnants of winter and breathing life back into the land. Flowers peeked through the thawing ground. Streams ran clear, and the sky was painted in endless shades of blue inside his cabin. Jacob Kane had grown accustomed to the sounds of life, the baby's soft coos, the occasional giggle, and the gentle rustling as she explored her small, safe world. Yet, beneath this newfound peace, an undercurrent of danger was approaching, a reality Jacob could not ignore. Word had begun to circulate in nearby towns and settlements. A missing infant had been found in the wilderness, and the authorities were searching for her. Jacob was a solitary cowboy, unaccustomed to confrontation with the law or the scrutiny of others. Yet he knew that he could not ignore the threat if word reached the wrong ears. The baby could be taken from him, placed in an orphanage, or worse, fall into neglectful hands once again. The thought filled him with a tense determination. He would protect her, no matter the obstacles. The sheriff arrived on a late afternoon, riding slowly down the dusty road to the cabin. His face was calm but wary, and in his hands was a folded letter, an official notice regarding the missing child. Jacob greeted him with a polite nod, hiding the surge of protectiveness that tightened his chest. The sheriff dismounted and handed over the letter, his eyes scanning the cabin and the baby. "We've had reports of a found infant," he said, voice steady. "We need to know your intentions. The law requires that the child be placed with proper authorities." Jacob's jaw tightened. He was not a man who spoke easily, but his voice carried authority and resolve. "She's safe here. I've cared for her since the moment I found her. The law may claim her. But she's alive because of what I've done. I won't let her be taken without proper consideration of her well-being." The sheriff's face softened slightly, but duty anchored his words. "I understand your care, Jacob, but the law must follow protocol papers, adoption hearings, and background checks. They're all required to ensure the child's safety." Jacob weighed his options. He could surrender the baby and hope the legal system would provide a safe home, or he could fight to keep her through official channels. The decision weighed heavily on him. This child had survived abandonment and near death. To him, it was more than legality, it was morality. Her life, her future, and her trust rested in his hands. He realized that protection was not just about survival, it was about advocacy, about ensuring that she had the best chance at a life filled with safety and love over the next days. Jacob took deliberate steps to navigate the challenges. He prepared documentation of his home, resources, and capacity to care for the baby. He made trips to the nearby town to meet with officials, quietly proving that he could provide a stable environment. Each decision carried risk. The longer he delayed, the higher the chance that someone else might intervene, or that the authorities could deem him unfit yet. Every action he took also strengthened his case and reinforced his commitment to the baby's welfare throughout this ordeal. The baby seemed to sense the tension, her tiny cries, sometimes repeating her soft, "Mama," reminded Jacob of the stakes. Her innocence and trust demanded more than survival. They demanded courage, wisdom, and the ability to make difficult decisions for her future. Neighbors whispered about the cowboy raising an abandoned child, and Jacob felt the pressure of community scrutiny, but he refused to falter. Every choice he made, legal, moral, and practical, was aimed at one goal: ensuring that this fragile life would not be uprooted from the safety and love she had found with him. Sun rose over the prairie in golden streaks, casting warmth on a world that had once seemed cold and indifferent for Jacob Kane. The morning light felt different this day, full of promise, yet heavy with responsibility. After weeks of navigating the challenges of survival, legal hurdles, and the persistent threats from the outside world, the cowboy had reached a pivotal moment in both his life and the life of the baby he had rescued. This day would mark the transformation of their fragile bond into something enduring. A family. Jacob had spent every waking hour preparing for this moment. Trips to the nearby town had secured the necessary papers for adoption. He had presented his cabin, his provisions, and his experience as a rugged frontiersman as evidence of his ability to care for the child. Officials had examined his home and commended his resourcefulness and dedication. Every step was painstaking. But Jacob knew that the true reward wasn't the stamp of legal approval. It was the chance to give this child a life free from abandonment, fear, and loneliness. The baby, who had once whispered a fragile "mama" into the wilderness, now cooed and reached toward him with outstretched arms. Her trust in him had grown through weeks of tender care, and she looked up at Jacob with a quiet confidence, as if she already knew he would never leave her. For Jacob, the sight was almost overwhelming. Years of solitude had left him guarded, but the raw vulnerability and innocence of this small life had softened his edges, filling him with a protective love he had never imagined possible. The adoption was formalized quietly in a small courthouse. The magistrate, a stern man softened by the evident devotion Jacob displayed, approved the guardianship. Jacob signed the final papers, each stroke of the pen cementing what had already been true in their hearts. He was now the child's official father, and she had a name, a home, and a future. He looked down at her tiny face, and the baby reached up as if sensing the gravity of the moment. In that instant, it didn't matter what the law required. What mattered was that she was his, and he would protect and guide her for the rest of his life. Returning to the cabin, Jacob carried the baby close, Feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest, the world outside seemed softer somehow. The prairie stretching wide and welcoming. No longer a place of desolation but a landscape of possibility, the cabin, which had been a simple shelter of wood and fire. Now hummed with warmth, life, and belonging, it had become a true home. A sanctuary where love and safety were tangible, not just abstract ideas as the weeks passed. Jacob established routines that cemented their bond further. He taught the baby about the land, about the animals, and even about the stars that glittered in the vast night sky. She learned to crawl across the cabin floor, giggle at the playful antics of the horses outside, and babble words that made him laugh with joy. Each milestone was a celebration, a reminder of the life he had fought so hard to protect. Slowly, the baby's cries of desperation transformed into laughter and curiosity, and Jacob's solitary existence blossomed into a life full of meaning and connection. Neighbors began to notice the change as well. Whispers of admiration spread through the frontier community. The rugged cowboy who had taken in an abandoned infant and raised her with unwavering care, Jacob didn't seek recognition. He sought only to see her thrive, yet the acknowledgement of their resilience only reinforced the extraordinary nature of their bond. By the time spring had fully arrived, the prairie seemed to mirror the transformation within the cabin. Life was no longer a struggle for survival alone. It was a celebration of connection, trust, and love. Jacob and the child had endured storms, threats, and the cold indifference of the wilderness together. They had forged something stronger than mere guardianship. They had forged a family. As Jacob watched the baby reach out to touch his face, her eyes bright and trusting, he realized that his life had changed forever. He was no longer a solitary cowboy wandering the frontier. He was a father, a protector, and a guide, and in that bond, fragile yet unbreakable, he discovered the true meaning of family. It was not given by birth alone, but created through love, sacrifice, and devotion. The prairies stretched endlessly before them, but the path forward was clear. Together they would face whatever came next, not as a lone cowboy and an abandoned child, but as a family forged in the crucible of hardship and hope.